The sun hung like a giant burning eye in the pale yellow sky, watching every grain of sand in the endless desert. The heat rose in shimmering waves, bending the horizon, making far shapes twist and vanish. The air was so dry it seemed to drink the breath of anyone who dared to walk too far. In the small alien village at the edge of the red dunes, every home was built from stone baked hard by the sun. The walls were thick to keep out the heat, the roofs flat and covered with dried plant mats. Narrow streets wound between the houses like little rivers of dust, and in the center of the village stood a tall black pillar, a marker older than the memory of anyone alive. It leaned slightly, as if tired of standing for centuries. The aliens called themselves the Koresh, their skin a dull bronze that matched the earth, their eyes wide and dark, shaped to see well in the sharp light. They lived quiet lives, farming small patches of tough desert plants and keeping herds of thick-coated desert beasts. They knew the land, they knew where to find water, and they knew what places must never be touched. One such place was the Red Dunes. They began just beyond the last rocky ridge, a rolling sea of crimson sand that seemed to shift even when there was no wind. No Koresh crossed them. No Koresh even stepped onto their edge, for the elders had taught them since birth that nothing beyond the dunes was for the living. Many tales were told of travelers who had wandered there and never returned. Some said the dunes swallowed them whole. Some said shadow creatures took them away. Others spoke of lights that danced at night and sang in voices that pulled you deeper and deeper until you were lost forever. James was the only human in the village, tall and pale compared to the Koresh, his hair the color of dried grass, his eyes bright and restless. He had arrived with a group of traders many months ago and stayed behind when they left. No one knew exactly why. Perhaps he found something here that others could not see. Perhaps he was running from something far away. Whatever the reason, he lived in a small stone house at the very edge of the village, closest to the dunes. From the first day, the elders warned him about the Red Dunes. They spoke slowly in the common trade tongue, so that he would understand. They told him the rules were simple. Never go past the last ridge. Never walk where the sand turns crimson. Never follow any lights or voices, for those who do will vanish like smoke. The oldest elder, a bent Koresh named Surah, looked into James's eyes and said in a voice like dry wind, "There is only death beyond." James listened with a half-smile on his lips. He nodded politely, but the elder saw something in his eyes, a kind of spark that did not belong to a man who feared old stories. Rue, a young Koresh who often watched James, noticed that he liked to stand on the ridge in the evenings, staring at the dunes as the sun set. The red sand would glow like embers, and James would stand very still, as if waiting for something to move out there. The warnings grew sharper. Surah told him that even the bravest hunters would not step into the dunes, that even the desert beasts would turn away. She told him of the traveler who walked in laughing and never came out. She told him of the shadow that followed another man back to the village and took him in the night. The whole time James only asked questions. How far did the dunes stretch? What lay beyond them? Had anyone ever returned? And to all these the answer was the same, no. One evening, as the heat began to fade and the sky turned soft orange, James sat with Rue outside his house. The wind carried the smell of dry plants and warm stone. Rue told him again to stay away from the dunes, his voice quiet but firm. James looked at him and grinned. "You just do not know where to look," he said, his voice calm like he had already decided something. Rue felt a shiver though the night was still warm. Later that night the elders met in the circle near the black pillar. They spoke of James and the way he watched the dunes. They feared that one day he would go in, and if he did the dunes would not let him go. Some argued they should make him leave the village before that happened. Others said the desert would take care of him if he was foolish. In the end they only agreed to warn him again and watch him closely. But James was different from the Koresh. The desert that filled them with fear seemed to fill him with wonder. He was drawn to it the way some men are drawn to the sea. Something in the red sand called to him, something the Koresh could not hear. In the quiet of his small stone home, he packed small things in a worn bag: water, dried food, a long knife, a rolled piece of cloth to cover his head from the sun, and all the while his lips curled into that same half-smile the elders had come to: distrust. The night sky spread wide and dark over the village, the stars burning cold above the heat of the land. In the distance the dunes lay still and silent, like sleeping giants, and somewhere in that deep silence James thought he heard laughter, faint and far, drifting on the desert wind like a promise only he could understand. Morning came with a sky as pale as bleached bone, the first light spilling across the desert like a thin golden river. The village woke slowly, the Koresh moving through their daily routines, tending to their beasts and checking the small water stores. But one figure was already awake long before the sun had touched the red dunes. James stood at the edge of the ridge, his shadow stretched long across the rocks, the worn bag slung over his shoulder, and a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, his boots sinking slightly into the dry earth as he took step after step toward the place no one dared to go. The air was cool for the moment, but the heat was already gathering, waiting to rise. The Koresh knew that soon the sand would become a burning field that could strip the skin from your feet. Yet James walked without fear. Ruth saw him from the doorway of his home and felt his chest tighten. He wanted to call out, to tell James once more to turn back. But something in the human stride said the decision was already made, and no word could pull him away now. One by one the villagers noticed him. Heads turned, voices murmured. The elders came from their homes, their long robes dragging lines in the dust. Surah stood with her staff in hand, her face carved in worry. She called his name, but James did not slow. His eyes fixed on the horizon, where the red dunes rose like frozen waves, glowing faintly in the rising sun. Every step took him further from the safety of the rocky ground and closer to the first slope of shifting crimson sand. The Koresh gathered on the ridge, a silent crowd watching him reach the edge. His boots touched the red sand, and a faint hiss rose, as if the grains themselves whispered at his arrival. The dunes moved subtly under his weight, sliding away from his steps, swallowing his footprints almost at once. Ruth felt a shiver run up his spine. It was as if the desert was alive and waiting for him. James paused just long enough to look back over his shoulder. His mouth curved into that small smile again. Then he lifted a hand in a casual wave and turned away, walking into the endless red. Hours passed, and the heat rose until the air trembled. Mirages bloomed across the horizon like phantom lakes. The Koresh returned to their tasks, though their eyes kept drifting toward the dunes. Every now and then someone thought they saw a flicker of movement far out in the sand, but it was never clear if it was James or the desert playing tricks. By midday the horizon was empty. The human had vanished into the glare and shimmer, leaving behind only silence. In the evening Rue climbed the ridge again. The sky deepened to a fierce orange, the dunes catching the dying light like molten metal. No sign of James. The elders gathered and spoke in low voices. Surah shook her head, her words sharp. She said the desert had claimed him and nothing could be done. A few younger Koresh argued they should send a search party at dawn, but the older ones refused, saying the desert's curse would take any who followed. Rue said nothing, though inside his mind questions burned like fire. Where had James gone? What did he hope to find? And why had he looked so certain? The night fell heavy and full of stars. The air cooled, but the red dunes seemed to hold their own faint glow under the moon. Rue lay awake on his narrow bed, listening to the soft creak of the walls and the cooling air. He imagined James walking under the starlight far from the ridge, the sand shifting beneath him, the darkness swallowing him whole. Yet part of Rue could not shake the feeling that James was not lost at all, that he was exactly where he wanted to be. At dawn the next day the village woke to another blazing morning. Still no sign of James. The Koresh carried on with the rhythm of life, as they always had, though the air felt heavier now, as if the dunes had stolen something from them. The young ones whispered among themselves, repeating the old stories about those who had vanished. Some claimed they could hear faint voices if they stood at the ridge in the stillest hours of the night. Others swore they had seen lights far beyond the first rise, pale and dancing like fireflies caught in glass. Rue could not ignore the pull. He found himself walking to the ridge every evening, staring into the distance until the sun dipped below the world. Each time he hoped for some movement, a flicker of a figure, a trace of a path in the sand. But the dunes remained silent and untouched. The wind smoothed away all marks, leaving them as they had always been, ancient and secretive. On the third morning after James had gone, Rue woke before the sun, the air still cool against his skin. He climbed the ridge in the dim half-light. The world was quiet except for the faint sigh of the wind moving between the rocks. He looked out over the dunes, their surfaces pale and shadowed in the early dawn, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw something. Far out, a shape moving, slow and steady. Then the sun rose, and the glare swallowed it, leaving him unsure if it had been real at all. The elders kept their watch from afar, though they no longer spoke openly of James. To them he was gone, another name for the stories told to warn the young. Yet to rue the human's disappearance was not the end, but the beginning of something strange, something that scratched at the edges of the mind, like a question you could never stop thinking about, the kind that kept you from sleeping. That night, as the wind whispered through the narrow streets, Rue dreamed he stood in the middle of the dunes, the sand cool beneath his feet though the sun blazed above. James was there, standing beside him, his face shadowed by the scarf. In his hands he held something green and round, its skin shining in the light. James said nothing, but his eyes seemed to speak, telling Rue to follow, to walk deeper into the red, until they reached something hidden from all others. Before Rue could ask what it was, a strange sound filled the air, like laughter carried from far away, and he woke with his heart pounding. Days turned into a week, and still there was no word, no sign. The Koresh stopped expecting him. Life returned to its steady pace, though an unease lingered like the taste of bitter water. And then, on the evening of the 8th day, as the sun bled its last light into the desert and the village prepared for night, a sound broke the stillness. Faint at first, then growing clearer, it was laughter, rolling across the dunes as if the sand itself was carrying it. The voices in the streets fell silent. Heads turned toward the ridge. There, on the horizon, a figure appeared, small at first against the vast sky, then clearer as it drew closer. The gait was familiar, the stride unbroken by exhaustion. The scarf hung loose around his neck, and slung across his back were shapes no one in the village had ever seen, green and heavy, catching the dying sunlight. Rue felt his breath catch. James was coming back. The crowd gathered on the ridge as the human walked the last stretch, his face sunburned but smiling, his eyes bright as if lit from within. He carried the strange green spheres, as if they were treasure, and as he stepped onto the rocky ground again, the whisper of the dunes faded behind him, leaving only the weight of the questions that every Koresh now burned to ask. The air was heavy with heat, though the sun had already slipped behind the far ridge. Shadows stretched long across the stone streets of the village. The Koresh stood together at the edge, every eye locked on the figure walking out of the red dunes. The laughter had come first, like a strange wind rolling over the sand, and now the source was here, stepping slowly, but with the easy pace of someone who had not been beaten by the desert. It was James, the human who had been swallowed by the crimson sea for more than a week, and across his shoulders hung two enormous green shapes that glistened faintly in the last light of day. As he drew closer, the crowd could see them more clearly. Smooth skins like polished stone, striped faintly with darker green, their size bigger than a Koresh child's head. They looked heavy, yet James carried them as if they weighed nothing. The smell reached them before he did, sweet and cool, so strange in the dry air of the desert. The villagers whispered among themselves, some eyes wide in wonder, others narrow with suspicion. No one had seen anything like these things before, and no one could imagine how such life could exist beyond the red dunes. Rue stepped forward before he could stop himself, the young Koresh's heart pounding in his chest. He had thought James would return burned and broken if he returned at all. But here he was, his skin sun-reddened, yet his eyes bright and alive, the same half-smile tugging at his mouth. Rue called his name, but James only raised one hand in greeting, his other hand steadying the green cargo on his back. The desert wind stirred the scarf around his neck, carrying with it a faint coolness that should not have been possible here. When he reached the ridge, the elders stepped forward, their robes shifting in the hot breeze. Sura planted her staff into the ground and spoke in a voice like gravel, asking where he had gone, how he had survived, and what these strange spheres were. James set them down gently on the stone ground, their weight thudding softly. Then he crouched beside one and tapped its skin with his knuckles. The sound was dull and deep. He said a single word, watermelon, and the crowd stared blankly. The word meant nothing to them. With a small knife pulled from his belt, James cut into the skin, the blade sliding with ease, and the villagers gasped as the outer green shell split to reveal a deep red heart studded with small black seeds. Juice glistened on the surface and dripped to the stone. The smell burst into the air stronger now. A fresh sweetness unlike anything the Koresh had ever known. James sliced a wedge and held it out toward Rue, who hesitated, glancing at Sura and the other elders, then took it in his hands. The cool, wet flesh shocking against his dry palms. He bit into it and felt the cold water rush across his tongue, sweet and rich, so unlike the bitter water of the wells. His eyes widened, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. The crowd pressed closer, each wanting a taste. James cut more slices, passing them out, laughter and murmurs spreading as the Koresh discovered the strange gift. Even the elders could not hide their curiosity. Sura tasted a piece, and her face, softened though her eyes remained wary. When the first melon was empty, its red heart scraped clean to the rind, James leaned back against the stone and watched them with quiet amusement, as if this had been his plan all along. Questions came from every direction. Where had he found them? How far beyond the dunes had he gone? Who had given them to him? James answered in a way that gave little away, saying only that he had found a place where the air was cool and the ground green, a place hidden so deep in the desert that no wind could touch it. He said there were people there, not Koresh, not human, but something in between, tall and thin with skin that shimmered like the horizon, their voices like water running over. Stone, they had welcomed him, offered him fruit and drink, and asked only one thing in return. The villagers leaned closer, asking what that one thing was. James's eyes glinted as he said they wanted stories, stories of the world beyond the dunes, of the stars and the ships that traveled between them, of the cities that shone like suns and the forests that whispered in the wind. He told them tales each night until the air grew cool and the stars wheeled overhead, and in the morning they gave him more of the green spheres to carry back. Sura's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and questioning. She asked why the people of the oasis had never come to the Koresh, why they remained hidden. James shrugged and said perhaps they feared the Koresh feared the dunes too much to seek them. Perhaps they liked the quiet life they had, or perhaps they simply did not wish to be found. The elders exchanged glances heavy with meaning, some distrust still in their eyes, but the younger villagers were already caught up in the wonder of the fruit and the thought of a hidden place filled with such abundance. Rue could not stop staring at James. The human seemed changed somehow, not just in the sunburn and the dust on his clothes, but in his manner, as if he carried a secret too large to share. When their eyes met, James gave a small nod that seemed to say later, and Rue knew without words that this was not the end of the story, that there was more hidden beyond those dunes than James had told them. Night came quickly, the heat easing as the stars emerged. The villagers carried the second watermelon to the center square, where they cut it and shared it under the light of small fires. Laughter and excitement spread through the crowd. Talk of making a journey to this oasis began to rise, though just as quickly the elders moved to quiet it, reminding all of the old warnings, of the dangers that had not vanished simply because one man had returned. James sat apart, his back against the black pillar, watching them, his eyes drifting toward the dark outline of the dunes under the starlight. The wind carried a faint sound from that direction, so faint that only he seemed to hear it, a ripple of voices like distant singing. His smile grew wider for a moment, then faded into something unreadable. Rue noticed and felt that same pull he had felt when James first left, that itch of curiosity that no warning could cure. When the fires burned low and the village began to sleep, James rose quietly, carrying the empty rind of the second melon to his home. Rue followed at a distance, watching as the human stepped inside and set something on the table, a small object wrapped in cloth. James unwrapped it slowly, revealing a handful of the black seeds from the fruit. He turned them over in his hand, the flicker of lamplight catching on their smooth surface, his expression thoughtful, almost reverent, as if he held more than just seeds but the start of something far greater. The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of the desert into the room. James closed the cloth around the seeds and tucked them away, then glanced toward the window where the dunes lay hidden in darkness. Somewhere beyond them the oasis waited, and perhaps something else waited too, something the Koresh would never believe until they saw it with their own eyes, and perhaps they never would, unless James decided otherwise. Morning rose over the desert in a slow wave of light spilling across the dunes and the rocky ridge. The village stirred with the sound of voices and footsteps. the sweet taste of the strange green fruit still fresh in their memory. Yet along with the wonder came a sharp edge of suspicion. The elders had called for James to come to the central square, their voices carrying the weight of authority, and the whole village gathered to watch. James walked into the square with the same steady stride he had shown when returning from the dunes, his scarf loose around his neck, the faint smell of the melon still clinging to the cloth. The Koresh eyes followed him, some warm with gratitude, others cold with doubt. The black pillar cast a long shadow across the circle as the elders formed a half-ring before him. Sura stood in the middle leaning on her staff, her face carved with lines that told of many seasons under the desert sun. She began by asking where the oasis truly was, her voice calm yet heavy, the crowd leaning in to hear. James answered that it was beyond the red dunes in a place where the sand gave way to grass and trees, where water ran in clear streams and fruit grew heavy on the branches. His words painted a picture that stirred the younger ones to quiet awe, but the elders were not so easily swayed. They asked why such a place would remain hidden for so long, why none of the Koresh who had dared the dunes in the old days had ever returned to tell of it. James said perhaps those travelers had gone too far or not far enough. Perhaps they had not been welcome. Perhaps they had not been able to see the signs that led to the oasis. Sura's eyes narrowed at this, asking what signs he meant. James said they were not marks on the ground but patterns in the wind and the light, paths that only revealed themselves if you knew how to listen to the desert. The words made the crowd murmur in low voices, for such ideas were strange to them. Another elder stepped forward, tall and thin with a deep voice that rolled like distant thunder. He asked who the people of the oasis were, what they looked like, what they wanted. James said they were tall and graceful, with skin that caught the sun like silver water, their eyes bright and calm. They lived in peace and grew food in abundance. They wanted nothing from him but the telling of stories. The elder frowned at this, for stories were not currency in the desert. The Koresh traded in water and food and tools, never in words, and so he asked again, was there truly nothing else James had given them? James paused for a heartbeat, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as if weighing what to say. Then he repeated that all they had asked for were stories of the stars and the worlds beyond the desert, stories that only a traveler could tell. Rue watched from the edge of the crowd and saw something flicker in James's eyes, a shadow quickly hidden. It was enough to plant a seed of unease in the young Koresh's mind, enough to make him wonder what truth was being kept out of reach. The questions went on, sharp and relentless. Did these oasis dwellers have weapons? Did they know of the Koresh? Would they welcome others? Would they allow the Koresh to take the fruit for themselves? James gave answers that danced between truth and mystery, saying they had no weapons for they had no need of them, saying they knew of the Koresh only through his stories, saying they might welcome others, but only if the others came with open hearts, saying the fruit grew freely and could be shared if trust was earned. The crowd shifted uneasily, for trust was not something they gave to strangers unseen. Sura leaned closer, her voice dropping though it carried in the still air. She asked why James had gone to the dunes in the first place, when he had been warned so many times. James's smile deepened. He said that sometimes the only way to learn if a wall is real is to walk straight into it. The answer made some laugh quietly, but others shook their heads, for such thinking was the way of fools or of those with plans they did not speak aloud. The meeting broke as the sun climbed higher, yet the air in the village remained heavy. The elders withdrew to speak in private, their long shadows slipping into the shade. The younger ones gathered in small groups, whispering of journeys and treasure. Rue lingered where he could see James. The human sat on the edge of the square with a piece of melon rind in his hands, running his thumb over the smooth inner surface as if lost in thought. The look on his face was not that of a man content to stay. It was the look of someone already halfway gone. Later that day, Rue found him outside his small stone house, the bag he had carried into the dunes now resting by the wall. Its shape changed as if it held something new. Rue sat beside him in the dust and asked in a low voice what he had truly given the people of the oasis. James looked at him for a long moment, then said softly that he had given them something no desert could offer, a door. Rue frowned, asking what that meant, but James only smiled and sliced a thin piece of melon, handing it to him without another word. The sun dropped and the heat bled from the land, shadows creeping over the ridge. In the square the voices of the Koresh rose and fell as the talk turned again to the possibility of finding the oasis. Some were eager, others afraid. The elders warned of the dangers, the shifting sands, the shadow creatures of old tales, the lights that lured you deeper. Yet the fruit in their hands made those warnings taste hollow, and more than one villager found themselves glancing toward the dunes with new eyes. That night the village was quieter than usual. The fires burned low. The air held a strange stillness. Rue could not sleep. He walked through the narrow streets until he reached the ridge. The red dunes lay dark under the starlight, their curves like frozen waves, and as he stared he thought he saw a flicker of movement far out where the earth and sky met. A pale shimmer that swayed like grass in the wind. He blinked and it was gone, leaving him with the echo of James's words in his mind. "A door." When he returned to the village, he saw light spilling faintly from the crack of James's door. Curiosity pulled him closer. Inside, James was at the table. The cloth unwrapped again. The seeds from the melon spread before him. He was arranging them in patterns, lines and curves that made no sense to Rue, his lips moving as if speaking to someone unseen. Then he paused and looked toward the window, his eyes meeting Rue's through the gap, and the young Koresh stepped back quickly. The look in those eyes was calm yet carried something deeper, a knowing that was both welcome and dangerous. Rue slipped away into the darkness, the scent of melon still in the air, the red dunes silent in the distance, and the question of what truly waited beyond them growing heavier in his mind. The days that followed were restless in the village. The taste of the strange green fruit lingered in every memory, and with it came a hunger not just of the tongue, but of the mind. Some of the Koresh began to speak openly of the oasis, as if it were already theirs to claim. Others spoke in hushed voices warning that the desert's old dangers had not vanished simply because a human had walked out of it smiling. The elders kept their counsel tight, their meetings long and their faces closed. But the air between the homes grew heavy with the weight of what was unspoken. James moved through these days as if the tension did not touch him. He repaired a broken roof for an old herder. He traded small metal tools with a craftsman. He sat with the children and carved small animals from scraps of wood. Yet Rue noticed that his eyes often wandered to the horizon, and at night there were times when James would leave his house and stand alone on the ridge for hours, the wind tugging at his scarf, the dunes lying still in the moonlight like a sleeping beast waiting to wake. The seeds from the melons were never far from him. Rue saw him carry them in a small pouch tied to his belt. Sometimes he would take them out and run them through his fingers, the way a warrior might check his weapons before a journey. Rue wondered why James had not planted them here where water could be brought from the wells. But he never asked, for the answer might open doors he was not ready to walk through. Whispers spread in the narrow streets. Some said James had made a bargain with the people of the oasis, a bargain that bound him to them in ways no one could see. Others claimed the fruit was not a gift but a lure, a way to bring the Koresh to the oasis, where they would be trapped or worse. The old stories of the dunes returned to the fireside talk. Shadows that moved without bodies, lights that sang in the night, travelers who walked in laughing and never came back. Rue wanted to believe in the wonder James had shown them. The cool, sweet taste of the melon was proof that something good existed beyond the red sands, yet he could not ignore the feeling that James carried more than just the memory of that place. There was a weight in his manner, as if he had seen something that changed him, and perhaps not for the better. Rue found himself watching the human more closely, searching for cracks in the easy smile and calm voice. One afternoon Sura came to Rue's home, her shadow falling across the doorway. She asked him what he thought of James, her voice low and careful. Rue hesitated, then said he did not know, that James had done nothing to harm them, that he had given them fruit and told them of beauty in the desert. Yet Sura's eyes narrowed as she asked if he believed every word. Rue admitted he was not sure. The elder nodded slowly, as if this was the answer she had expected. She told him that sometimes truth is hidden not by lies but by silence, and that silence could be the most dangerous of all. That night the wind rose, carrying the fine red dust through the village. The air tasted dry and sharp. James was seen walking toward the ridge again, this time carrying his pouch of seeds and a water skin. Rue followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. He watched as James stood at the crest looking out over the dunes, the wind pulling his hair back, the moonlight catching on the metal clasp of the pouch. James held it in both hands for a moment as if weighing it, then tucked it back at his side and turned toward the village, without a word. The next morning the elders called another meeting in the square. This time the mood was sharper. One elder spoke of sending scouts to follow James if he returned to the dunes. Another suggested they take the seeds from him and plant them here. James listened without protest, leaning on the black pillar. When asked what he thought, he said simply that the seeds would not grow here, that they belonged to the place they had come from, and if planted elsewhere they would wither. The words only deepened the divide between those who trusted him and those who did not. Rue found himself caught between the two sides, his curiosity pulling him toward the truth, while his caution told him to step back. He tried to speak to James again in private, asking if he planned to return to the oasis. James looked at him for a long moment and said he might, that there were more stories to tell and more to see. Rue asked if he would take anyone with him. James shook his head with a slow smile, saying not yet. The words were soft but carried a finality that Rue could not push past. In the days that followed, small changes began to creep into the village. A few Koresh were seen walking closer to the ridge than before, staring at the dunes for long stretches, as if trying to see the hidden paths James had spoken of. A herder reported hearing laughter in the night coming from far across the sand. Another claimed to have seen shapes moving against the moonlit horizon. The elders dismissed these as tricks of wind and light, yet their eyes showed no comfort. One evening Rue walked past James's home and heard a voice inside speaking in a tone unlike any he had heard from the human before, low and steady like someone speaking to a friend who was far away. He paused by the wall and listened. The words were in no tongue he knew, a soft flowing language that seemed to ripple like water. Then there was a silence, followed by the scrape of a chair. Rue stepped back quickly as James appeared in the doorway, his eyes shadowed but calm. He asked Rue if he needed something. Rue shook his head and walked away, the sound of that strange voice still turning in his mind. The doubt grew thicker with each passing night, not just in Rue but in the whole village. The gift of the fruit was sweet, but its aftertaste was heavy. James had crossed the red dunes and returned, something no Koresh had done in living memory. Yet instead of ending the fear of the desert, his return had deepened it, making the dunes not just a barrier of sand but a border to something unseen, something that could reach across the ridge in whispers and dreams. On the seventh night since the questioning, Rue woke before dawn to the sound of soft footsteps outside his home. He rose quietly and followed them through the dim streets, past the sleeping houses and up to the ridge. There in the pale light of the stars was James, the pouch of seeds at his belt, his water skin full, his gaze fixed on the dark curve of the dunes. He stood there for a long time, the wind moving around him as if bending toward his presence. Then, without looking back, he began to walk down into the sand, each step carrying him deeper until the earth swallowed the sound of his boots. Rue stood frozen, the first edge of sunlight breaking over the horizon, the red dunes glowing faintly as they took the human back into their endless embrace. When James did not return by the second night, the village began to stir with unease. The desert stretched beyond the ridge like an open mouth, waiting, its red skin glowing under the twin moons. The memory of the fruit was still fresh on the tongues of the Koresh, and it pulled at them like a whisper, a promise of sweetness in the endless heat. Some spoke of sending a search party. Others said that James had chosen his path, and that to follow would be to invite the same fate that had taken so many before him. Rue found himself standing at the ridge each evening, the wind lifting grains of sand into his face. He would look for movement, a shadow, a figure in the distance. Yet there was nothing. The dunes lay still as if carved from stone. Sometimes the wind would carry a faint sound that could have been laughter or could have been nothing, and each time it made his heart twist, for he could not tell if it was a call or a warning. The elders gathered again in the meeting house, their voices sharp and low. Sura spoke of the danger of waiting too long, of the seeds that James had guarded, of the way his stories had lit a hunger in the hearts of the young. She said that the desert might not be the curse they had believed, that perhaps it was only fear that kept them bound to the wells. Another elder snapped that fear was what had kept them alive for generations, that to throw it away for the taste of a strange fruit was madness. By the third night, there were quiet movements in the streets, small groups of Koresh meeting in corners, speaking of how they could reach the oasis if they left before dawn. Some said they had dreamed of the place. The dreams were bright and cool and full of running water. Others admitted they could not stop thinking of the green vines and the heavy fruit. Ru listened but said little. Yet the dreams began to come to him as well, soft images of shade and laughter and a voice that might have been James telling him that the desert was not to be feared but to be embraced. The children began playing games where they pretended to cross the dunes, calling to one another as they climbed the low hills near the ridge. They laughed and spoke of finding fruit bigger than their heads. Some of the mothers tried to stop them, but the laughter was hard to silence. It carried through the streets like a spark in dry grass, feeding the restless air that now hung over the village. On the fourth day, Ru saw something strange. Near the base of the ridge, where the sand met the hard earth, there was a patch of ground that looked damp. He crouched and touched it. The moisture was real, though there had been no rain. He dug a little and found a thin root that pulsed faintly as if alive. It ran toward the dunes and vanished under the sand. Ru felt a cold rush in his chest as he covered it again, unsure if he should tell anyone. That evening Sura came to him and asked if the dreams had reached him. Her eyes were shadowed but sharp. Ru nodded slowly, and she told him that she believed the oasis was calling them, that James had not stumbled upon it by chance, that perhaps it had found him. She said that the desert could be alive, not in the way of people or animals, but in some older, deeper way, and that it might want them to come. Ru asked if that was not dangerous. Sura smiled without warmth and said that everything worth having carried danger with it. By the fifth night the restlessness broke into action. A group of young men and women came to the square before dawn carrying water skins and cloth wraps for the sun. They said they were going to follow James's path and bring back more fruit. The elders tried to stop them, but their voices were drowned in the rising murmur of the crowd. Some shouted encouragement, others shouted warnings. The group did not wait for permission. They began climbing the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the pale light of the moons. Ru did not join them, though his legs ached to move. He watched until they vanished into the dunes, the wind swallowing their tracks. The village stood in uneasy silence after they were gone. The elders turned their anger on Sura, accusing her of feeding the temptation with her words. She did not deny it, only said that if they came back with fruit, then perhaps it was time for the Koresh to see the desert not as a wall, but as a bridge. The day passed slowly, the heat pressing down like a weight, the sky a pale white above the red earth. Ru wandered to the ridge again and thought of the damp patch and the strange root. He wondered if it had grown from the seeds James carried. He wondered if the oasis could send its life across the sands the way roots crept through soil. He thought of James's strange language spoken in the night, and felt a shiver despite the heat. That night the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that was not of dust or dry grass. It was sweet and faint, like the air in the dreams. Some in the village woke, and stood in their doorways breathing deeply, as if trying to drink it in. Ru lay awake listening, and in the stillness he thought he heard footsteps far out in the dunes, slow and steady, as if many were walking in time. He sat up, but saw only the dark waves of sand rolling under the moon. The next morning the young group had not returned. Some said it was too soon. Others whispered that the desert had taken them. The elders called for the people to stay away from the ridge, but by evening another two slipped away, their families searching for them in vain. The pull of the oasis was growing stronger with each day without James, and even those who had once sworn never to leave the wells now found their thoughts drifting toward the horizon. Ru began to fear that soon the village would be empty, taken not by force but by longing. He spoke to Sura again and asked if there was a way to resist the call. She told him that the only way to end it was to see it for himself, that once he knew what lay in the heart of the desert he could decide whether to stay or to go. Her words felt like both a warning and an invitation, and Ru knew that the moment was coming when he would have to choose. That night he dreamed again, but this time the voice in the dream was clearer. It told him that James was waiting, that the fruit was ripe and the water was cool, that the path was safe if he did not look back. Ru woke with the sound still in his ears, his hands trembling. He stepped outside and found the air heavy with the same sweet scent. The ridge loomed in the darkness, and far away a faint glow pulsed in the desert like the heartbeat of something alive. The night was silent except for the whisper of the wind moving over the dunes. Ru stood at the ridge with the village lights at his back, and the endless dark sea of sand before him. The faint glow in the distance seemed to pull slowly, as if breathing, each breath pulling at him. He tightened the water skin on his shoulder and stepped forward. The sand shifted beneath his feet, like a living thing, but he kept walking, each step carrying him further from the safe earth of the Koresh. Behind him the village shrank into a cluster of dim sparks. Ahead the dunes rolled endlessly. The sky above was thick with stars like cold fires. The air was warm and heavy with that strange sweet scent. It seemed to grow stronger with every step, as if the source was not far away, though he knew the desert stretched for days. His mind kept drifting to the stories James had told. The laughter, the cool water, the heavy green vines. He wondered if the stories had been only stories, or if James had truly found a place untouched by the thirst of the world. The first hours were easy under the moons, the sand cool and soft under his feet. But as the light faded and the true dark took hold, the desert began to change. Shadows moved in the corner of his vision, though nothing was there when he turned. The wind carried sounds that might have been words, but were too faint to understand. He felt the weight of the silence pressing close, as if the dunes themselves were leaning in to listen to his thoughts. He stopped once to drink, the water warm but still welcome. As he lifted the skin from his lips, he heard a laugh far off. It was light and careless. It could have been James or someone else. He turned toward the sound, but saw only the pale curve of the next dune. Still the laugh came again, drifting on the wind. He began to climb. At the top of the dune he saw something strange, a thin line cutting across the sand, faintly glimmering in the moonlight. He knelt and touched it. It was a vine, green and alive, its surface cool against his skin. It ran in a straight path toward the glow, small tendrils branching off and disappearing into the sand. He followed it, feeling the air grow cooler, the wind softer, the scent sweeter still. The vine thickened as he walked until it was as wide as his arm, twisting and pulsing faintly, as if something inside moved like slow water. Hours passed, though the moons did not seem to move. Time felt strange. His legs grew heavy, yet each step seemed lighter than the one before, as if the desert was lifting him. The glow ahead grew brighter now, not a single point but a shimmering wall like heat haze. Beyond it he thought he saw the dark shapes of trees, their leaves swaying though there was no wind. He felt a sudden rush of joy and fear together, his heart beating fast in his chest. As he drew closer the glow began to form shapes, curling patterns that moved like writing though he could not read them. The patterns shimmered in colors he could not name. His eyes watered, and his skin tingled as if the light was touching him. The vine he followed now rose out of the sand and became a twisting bridge of green leading into the haze. He stepped onto it and felt it sway slightly under his weight. Yet it held firm, the surface cool and almost soft like the flesh of a fruit. On the other side of the haze the air was different, heavy with moisture. The sand gave way to rich soil, dark and soft under his feet. Tall trees rose around him, with leaves the size of blankets, their trunks thick and smooth. Vines hung from the branches heavy with fruit, some round and green, others deep red. The scent here was overwhelming, sweet and warm. His mouth filled with water at the sight of the fruit, and he reached for one without thinking. Before his fingers touched it he heard the laugh again, closer now. And from behind one of the trees James stepped into view, his skin darker from the sun, his eyes bright. He was carrying 2 huge watermelons under his arms. He called out to Ru with a grin, saying that he had been waiting, that the oasis had chosen him, and now it had chosen Ru too. The way he spoke made it sound as if the place itself could think and speak. Ru felt a shiver even in the warm air. James told him there was water nearby, clearer than the sky, cold enough to bite, and that the fruit never spoiled, that the vines grew without end. He led Ru to a pool where the surface shone like glass. Strange fish swam beneath, their scales glowing softly. Ru knelt to drink, and the water filled him with a rush of energy, so strong he gasped. The weariness of the journey vanished. Every part of him felt alive. Yet as he drank he noticed something in the water. Faint shapes moving in the depths, too large to be fish, their outlines shifting like smoke. One rose toward the surface, but faded before it broke through. He looked at James, who only smiled, and told him not to worry, that the oasis was alive, but it was a friend. that it gave to those who came with open hearts. Rue tried to believe him, but the shapes in the water had left a cold knot in his stomach. They walked deeper into the grove, the air buzzing faintly with unseen insects, the ground soft and springy. Every tree seemed to lean slightly toward them as if watching. Rue noticed more vines snaking along the ground, some disappearing into the water, others climbing the trees. A low hum filled the air, steady and slow like a heartbeat. James said he would understand it soon, that in time it would speak to him too, that once it spoke he would never want to leave. Rue asked about the others from the village who had come. James hesitated only a moment before saying they were here too, though they had gone further in, where the light was brightest and the air sweetest. He said that once they reached that place, they would not return. His smile held something Rue could not read, and for a moment he thought James's eyes glimmered like the strange light in the haze. They came to a clearing where the ground was covered in soft moss. At the center stood a single massive fruit on a thick stem, its skin deep green, veins of gold running through it. The hum in the air seemed to come from it. James told him this was the heart of the oasis, that eating from it would bind him to the place forever. Rue felt the pull of it like a hand on his chest, yet he also felt the faint ache of the village in his mind, the faces of those still waiting. James stepped back and gestured for him to take it. The hum grew louder, the scent thick and warm. Rue's hands trembled as he reached out. He felt the air tighten around him, the trees leaning closer, the pool behind them rippling though no wind touched it. The shapes beneath the water shifting faster now, the heartbeat sound quickening. His fingers brushed the smooth skin of the fruit, and the hum rose into a deep thrumming that seemed to shake the ground. In that moment Rue knew that whatever he chose now would decide not only his fate, but the fate of the village. The oasis seemed to be waiting, holding its breath, the vines around the clearing curling slowly, as if ready to move. James's smile fixed and bright as the light from the haze flickered like a flame about to burst.